Hi everyone, my name is Kene. I'm a co-founder and partner at Arck Wealth. Today I'm joined by my fellow partners in finance, Adrian Jossel to your far left and next to him Raymond Gombera. I think today we're discussing, a lot of successful founders believe they diversified. They have many income streams, properties, stock portfolios, but what are some of the misconceptions we find ourselves when it comes to, or people understand about diversification today? Don't know if you want to take that, Ray.
Yeah, sure. So the term diversification, I think, is quite broad. And I think, yes, you're quite right. I think a lot of people, their understanding of what this diversification means, I think it's, everyone's got their own sort of understanding of what diversification means. But I think in our space, diversification can be anything to do with your investment strategy. What sort of investments are you invested in? Is it equity? Is it property? Is it private equity? So there's so many sort of arms to diversification, but I suppose it just depends on what the individual is trying to achieve. And I think diversification even goes to the fact that a lot of people might feel like they own property in Joburg and some in Cape Town, and they think that's diversification. Again, these are all the different nuances of diversification that are there. But I think it boils down to the individual, what their ultimate goal is, and what sort of exposure they're actually, comfortable to, for their investments to be exposed to. Again, in our space, we talk about investment management, we talk about physical money, what sort of assets you want to hold in a portfolio. It could be private assets, it could be, listed shares and equities. It could be also property, but not direct property. It could be property through some sort of investment or fund. There's also diversification where you want a bit of liquidity. So it all depends. I think it's quite broad. But I think the misconception really is, I suppose it's more lack of understanding of what it means or what the term is, what it actually extends to. So again, it's more just people needing to be a bit educated, depending on what they're actually trying to achieve. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think further to what Ray was alluding to, I think it's got to be very individual specific. I think everyone's got to understand the pros and cons of each asset class, how it works, and what, to Ray's point, the ultimate goal was. I mean, depending on your investment horizon, typically equities or stocks would perform better over the long term, but do you have 10 years to put up, or do you need income? They always say that the only free lunch we have with investing is diversification, but I think to Ray's point, to go a step further, is really understanding each individual at their level, what part of their life they're in and what ultimately they're looking to achieve. And that's something we need to listen to specifically from clients to provide them the right advice.
Okay. So essentially, true diversification is not about what you own, is how they interact with each other when world events happen or different things change, life events, etc.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I sort of think of it like short, medium, and long term.
Yeah.
In terms of liquidity would be cash flow. You need to have ample cash flow to cover unforeseen events. Medium term would be other assets potentially that can withstand a bit of volatility, but can obviously provide some balance. And then your longer dated, I mean, the hot topic is this private equity, but what does that really mean? To truly see true value in private equity, you have to hold it for a period. I mean, you think of SpaceX, the biggest IPO to come out in June now. People have been waiting for this time for 10, 12, 15 years, but it's taken that time to build the value.
Yeah.
I think people need to realize that time is also important. How much time do we have? So it's, we all want returns, but what are we willing to give up? I think to Ray's point, property, maybe lack of liquidity, but it gives you physical sort of maybe peace of mind. The other side is stocks and shares are liquid, but they have the volatility, but good long-term growth. It's just about balancing that.
Okay. And I guess that's the quiet difference between looking diversified on balance sheet and actually being diversified. Now, you touched on SpaceX. Let's pivot to business owners. What are some of the blind spots that you've seen with business owners that are clients, whose personal wealth is tied to their business?
Yeah. I think when we talk about business owners, we're talking about mostly entrepreneurs as well. I think it will relate to them. So entrepreneurs, just by nature, all they're trying to do is scale their business. They're more involved in wanting to just make sure that the business does well, that it's a going concern, They could have a target of what they want that business to get to in terms of value, or it's just a passion. It's a passion of, this is something that I've built from scratch. I made it work. I've proved some naysayers wrong, but ultimately it's a case of, there's a lot that comes with business owners that I guess a lot of people don't actually look at, because you're focused on just, this is the business, I need it to work, I need it to make money. But outside of that, there are other things as well that people don't take account. Say, for example, one of your employees who's, I guess, from a strategy perspective, they're very involved in the business, etc. Without them in the picture, what does that look like? So do you have an easy replacement for them, for their skill set? Have you planned for that? Key man insurance, for example, somebody like that, you lose that. Do you have something like that in place? And also, entrepreneurs and business owners, they've got most or significant part of their money or asset investment into the business. If you talk about diversification, as Adrian alluded to, what does that look like? So the business doesn't do well. If you're involved in horticulture or the fruits agricultural sector, for example, you talk about what happened recently with the introduction of new tariffs on South African products into the US, for example, and the US being one of the benefactors of some of the produce from South Africa. What does that actually look like for you? What are the alternatives? So I think entrepreneurs and business owners unfortunately only have one asset, one investment. Most of their money is invested in that business. So if God forbid something happens to that business, what actually happens else? I mean, do you have liquidity? Maybe, if you wanted, something happens within the business where you actually need physical liquid cash. Where is that going to come from? Do you have provisions for that? There's some sort of cover or risk policies that you have in place to cater for that. So again, it speaks to diversification, because a lot of entrepreneurs are not diversified. Everything is invested in that business, which is a concern.
Okay. I think you touched on two key points there, how business owners tend to underinsure their own life and they overinsure their businesses, and also treating their business like their retirement plan, as opposed to, stress testing it. What happens, if what that business is worth to someone else, what happens if you're not there the next day? Those are some of the key issues. Adrian, what would you say, another blind spot where people say business owners mistake control for safety? Do you want to just expand on that?
I think it's a very important point. Take us, we started a business, you go through it, I think personally what it means to you and what you've gone through that program. There's, sacrifices, monetary-wise, family-wise, that you put into it and really want to see a success, because it's always sort of likened to a child that you've had. You see it goes from infancy and grow through, and you really want to see a success. Sometimes that can be, to your point, a blind spot that people forget about, that it becomes mature, it comes into something and it becomes self-sustaining. But, to Ray's point, maybe you've got one or two contracts and they fall through and you lose 70% of your revenue. What happens then? To Ray's point, you could be the key founder that's literally all the decisions are made around you, and something sudden happens, and then what happens after that? You've built so much equity into this business. What happens with your family? Do they need to sell it at a discount? What's the true? There's so many variables, and I think to your point, you used the word stress test. That's hyper important. You need to go through these what ifs. Sometimes it's an uncomfortable discussion to have, but the way we position it and we say to clients, you've taken so long to build something and you put so much heart into it. Do you really want it to go down? Maybe 15, 20 years you've taken in the space of 6 months if something should happen. And sometimes it's important to get an independent perspective on those things, because you've got so much emotion tied into it. Sometimes you must take a step back and let someone to come and say, well, these are the potential blind spots that you haven't noticed. Can we help you be better at managing it, or give you some perspective on how to look at that moving forward? So I think it's about perspective.
No, I think having said that, once these structures are in place for business owners, and it's outside of the financial outcomes of these structures, and the business is taken care of, we've advised them on how to structure their personal and their business assets, to give them that peace of mind. What changes would you say you've seen on an emotional or psychological standpoint once these things are in play?
I think the thing is, I think it's something that if you hold something so tight, you know what I mean, you start letting go a little bit, it kind of gives you that sense of relief. And I think if you tell the person you let go and it's okay and things are going to be all right because we've shown you exactly from a numbers point of view how things could work if we do this, I think once you relinquish a little bit, you can maybe think a bit clearer and give a bit more perspective. I think once someone maybe does that, they can actually feel much better in their decision making moving forward, potentially for the business. Because, I mean, as we all know, we all want to scale to some point to be successful, but then what are the next steps? Is it an exit plan? Do you want to build it out in multinational or throughout different parts of Africa? I mean, those are all those other discussions. But it feels like, I think founders get into such a space that they get comfortable and they're so scared of letting go that if they do, things are just going to unravel and fall apart. As opposed to saying, what could be the next steps, and let's be a little bit more, I think, strategic about that.
So I think once that noise stops, and then, you know, I think the question then moves from what am I actually doing to what do I want, or am I doing enough to what is it I actually want to do with my life? How do I shift? How do I shift attention to my family or my spouse? Ray, what have you seen with some of your clients once this kicks in over the medium to long term?
And again, I mean, maybe just a bit of, you know, what Adrian mentioned as well. I think with a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs, it's lack of planning. And I think the lack of planning comes with, again, you know, this grip that you've got on the business, because I guess on the one hand, you're focused on just making sure the business is sustainable. On the other end, it's just a case of, you know, this is mine and, you know, I need to make it work, etc. And you don't actually allow for input from the outside, you know, or take advice, or as Adrian said, you know, take a step back and maybe just have a bit more of a review of what your current circumstances actually mean in the long term, you know. So at what point do you exit? You know, some of the things that we've come across, you know, sitting down with business owners is, you know, they don't have enough liquidity in the business. God forbid something does happen to Adrian, to what Adrian was saying, that, you know, say for example, something significant happens to the business where it's not as profitable for, you know, for a period. You know, what measures do you have in place to counter that? Subsequent to that, God forbid something happens to you as the main owner or the business owner and you don't have a succession plan. You know, what does that look like? If the business is mainly to do with assets that are not liquid, you know, what provisions have you put in place to make sure that if there is a liquidity event that requires physical money, where's the money going to come from? And I think Adrian mentioned that as well. Is it going to be a fire sale out of one of the assets that you've got, selling it for, you know, at a discount just because now you've got, you know, a liability to address? So these are some of the things that we've come across. And I think that's the advice we're giving to clients, you know, to say it's not just about the business being a going concern. It's about all the other things that come in there as well. You know, what if there's a liquidity event, what do you have in place? Maybe look at, you know, risk cover, life cover, for example. Is it adequate cover that you've got in place? Your business is valued as X. Some of the liabilities that come when you do pass on the taxes, the taxman is knocking on the door. It's actually expensive to die. And then, you know, where does that money come from? You know, so these are all things, real things that business owners haven't thought of. And I think it'll be prudent to look at that.
And if I can say one more thing, I think also the more intangible part of it is the emotional part. You know, think about it. Taking 20 years to build something up, you pass away, you don't have these discussions. What is the net effect on your family? You know, have you had these discussions with your kids, with your wife, business partners? You know, it's sometimes difficult conversations to have, but that's, I think that's another complete different area that we're not factoring, because we're thinking purely from a monetary point of view, which is just as important. What is the net effect from an emotional point of view? Infighting, all of that. So that's, you know, all these dynamics need to be addressed.
Right. I think most high achievers carry this worry, you know, are my loved ones going to be okay if something happens to me? So I think it is important to address these issues. So let's shift to reevaluating some legacy investment beliefs. We've all heard the story, you know, properties always safe, local exposure is enough, growth solves everything, you know. So which of these traditional beliefs do you guys no longer, you know, believe render true in today's day and age? and maybe some other ones that I might not have touched on.
Yeah. I think from, if I could just come in, I think, you know, things like property, for example, I think just as South Africans, you know, we love property, we love, you know, bricks and mortar, the touch and feel. You get your rental income from your tenants, you know, every month. That's money, that's physical money coming in. So there's a more tangible sort of income and benefit or growth or return as you see it, because you've got a monetary value that's coming into your bank account every month. But I think there's nothing wrong with property. It's a good diversifier. If you've got the right asset, if you're in the right neighborhood, that's obviously calling on the right level of income based on all the other liabilities you need to pay for, raise taxes, etc. So net, you know, there's sort of a lot of things you need to consider to actually make it look, or for it to be profitable. But also, I think what a lot of people look at, especially regarding property, what people don't actually look at is how profitable actually are you in real terms? Because you look at, you know, things like you have to pay the city of Joburg their rates. Maybe you've got a property agent that you're paying for them to manage the relationship between, you know, your property and the tenants. There's upkeep of the property. These are all liabilities. Obviously, it's not a month-to-month thing, but these are all liabilities that need to be settled. That's money coming out, and it's coming out of that, I suppose, the income that you're getting, or you could actually be dipping into your own pockets to offset that. There's also taxes that you pay on that income. You know, so there's income tax that you're paying depending on what your marginal rate is. You know, so these are all liabilities that I guess a lot of people, yes, it looks like there's money coming into your pocket, but is it actually profitable? What are you benchmarking it against? Is there another asset that you could look at that you could actually get better profits than the risk that you're taking with just property? So yes, property, just as an example, you know, those are some of the things that I think a lot of people don't consider.